Oh, hi. Fascinating graphs. Did you take into account when you were looking at death taxes? I did a personal computation of my own and figured at the end of it when I paid my death tax when it didn't matter to me, so I didn't care, it seemed fair, that I was going to come out as a net contributor. So I wondered whether or not you were going to, that had been included in your...
Yeah, that includes all the main taxes, including inheritance tax, which is that little... And to be honest, although there's a lot of anxiety about inheritance tax, it is a tiny element of tax. So this yellow line, this yellow bar, is inheritance tax. It really is not much. In fact, I have to say it's a classic bad tax, which is it's a very high, scary rate, 40%. But above a very high threshold. So not many people actually will pay it. And revenues from inheritance tax are, as you can see, very small indeed. So yes, they are included. And of course, some of the other capital taxes are extinguished on death. So capital gains tax is not levied on your estate. Instead, it is inheritance tax. So yes, it is included.
Okay, next one, please. The gentleman, John.
In a sense, building on that question, but doesn't this mechanism auto-correct? Because boomers do die, and while a small portion goes to tax, otherwise it goes to inheritance, and it's feeding a much smaller population group. So over time, that will correct, and effectively, children are getting pension top-ups from their baby boomers passing away, because this wealth has to go somewhere.
Yeah.
Or am I missing something?
No. Well, 2 points. First of all, that doesn't apply on pensions. And pensions, although the houses are the visible bits, the pensions are the, here we are. Actually, pensions, the property figure is net of mortgages. So pensions are even a more important part of our wealth. And we have these pensions claims, these payments to us year after year, which are extinguished on our death, which are incredibly valuable. So that's the first answer. The second answer is, however, yes, indeed, the housing can be inherited. The median age of inheritance is now 61. So we have quite a wait, and actually one of the unstated reasons for the housing pressures is as people live longer, so any given bit of housing stock is occupied by someone for longer. But we will eventually inherit, but that inheritance is very heavily skewed. And that goes back to the question of what kind of society we want to live in. And if the route to owning your own home is having parents who own their own home, and in particular the route to owning a valuable property in the southeast is having parents who own a valuable property in the southeast, we are a less mobile society. Why should you work hard and try to make your way in the world when it's the inheritance that's eventually going to determine your ability to own a property? So yes, there is some inheritance of housing wealth, but the other main form of wealth is extinguished. And I won't inflict a further chart on it, but there is, and this inheritance is not evenly spread. It's quite concentrated.
Right. Next question, please. We'll take the gentleman in the yellow jacket, please.
Thanks for that entertaining description of the baby boomers getting into the public transport with their Oyster card and going to work. I thought that was quite revealing, because when you looked at the chart showing the crossover between youth consumption and over 60s consumption, and you see it crossing over,
yep.
I think it's too simple to say, well, it's because the rich are so much more wealthy now. It's also because the older, are so much more wealthy now. It's also because the older are still going to work, age 65 and 75. And the reason that the younger cohorts aren't consuming as much is partly because they are anti-consumption. They've got different values which lead them to consume less, other than organic chickens and lattes and so on. So I wasn't completely convinced by the figures. And when it came to the total amount of wealth, one of the reasons there's so much more wealth now is because of asset inflation due to post-2008 loosening, fiscal loosening. So on balance, I feel like I'm still confused by the numbers and not convinced.
Right. Well, let me try. I mean, first of all, you're right that more pensioners are working. Yes, that is the case. However, younger people are working harder as well. We have record total employment. And on consuming, they don't want to consume. I am afraid, I think that is part of how we comfort ourselves as to what is really happening to our kids. It is true there has been changes in tastes. Some people also say to me, young people don't want to own houses anymore. The polling evidence is yes, young people do want to own a house. They certainly are not so interested in owning a car. I accept that's a social and cultural change. The idea of having some great big lump of metal parked outside your house for sort of 90% of the time. I think if I were a car manufacturer, I would detect a big shift away from car ownership. They do want consumption. They are consuming. They do eat out a bit more, though, as I said, boomers, if anything, eat out even more now. So I don't think they're against consumption in general. They are just income constrained in what they can consume. And then, so yes, you're right, one of the drivers, not the only driver, one of the drivers of pensioner incomes is indeed pensioner work. No, there's not an overall evidence that young people don't want to consume, though perhaps some reduction in interest in ownership of certain assets and consumption more from part-time renting things. And then, and then on housing, let's go to the house price chart, if I can find, sorry, I've gone the wrong way. And there, as I said, QE is the last twist in the, So I accept that QE is part of the story. I accept that that part is QE. It's more moderate in the rest of the country. But this is a trend that precedes QE. So yes, QE is part of it, but both the pension story and the housing story, both of the asset stories, in some ways what's most striking about them is they're true for decades of monetary expansion, decades when there wasn't monetary expansion, decades when the economy has grown strongly, decades when the economy has not grown strongly. So there's a significant pre-QE effect as well.
Thank you very much. Interesting, I was glad that you referred to regional differences because underneath this, particularly about life expectancy, I think particularly in interaction with areas of deprivation, there isn't now a rising life expectancy. So I'm sure you're looking very actively at that story there. But I also particularly wanted to ask whether you have any headlines if you disaggregate for gender.
Yes. Now that is and I think the most, and I haven't got this by gender, but it is the case that if you were to disaggregate the earnings story by gender, there is better news for younger women. And one thing that has happened is that partly as women have surged into higher education, now for people in their 20s and early 30s, women are earning as much as men, pretty much. There is, so far, that trend doesn't look to last beyond the early 30s. It looks like when the kids arrive, even now, there is a hit to female earnings. And many women, regardless of whether they try to go back to work or not, what childcare arrangement, it looks as if women are often then on a different earnings trajectory than men. And that is still a very real kind of challenge in public policy. But there is, you could say that my picture of people doing worse, certainly in the jobs market, is more acute for men than for women. There has been an underlying shift towards improved economic opportunities for women, which is a good thing. It does help them, particularly in their 20s, yeah. Asset ownership, by the way, is not significantly shifted yet. That is still preponderantly male.
Great. We'll take a question from the middle here, please.
Thank you. Just a quick point about the difference between tackling problems with monetary policy, which seems to favour the young who are borrowers and hurt the older cohorts who are savers, which is what we've done so far. But now with QE having hit the buffers, if we're now going to move into using fiscal policy of borrowing now to spend now and having to pay the interest later, does that actually compound the problems that you're looking at intergenerationally?
Yes, but remember what the previous gentleman's point about QE, and it depends, of course, if you're looking at the income effect or you're looking at the capital effect. But the low interest rates, and I can remember discussing the triple lot with David Cameron and saying, I think this is a very expensive commitment to one group. What about other groups? And David's reply was, but those pensioners who've got £10,000 in their Halifax Building Society account are now seeing virtually no interest income from it. So we must do this to help them. And that was a tranche, that was a sort of slice of opinion. Pensioners with relatively modest savings for whom the interest income fell in the post-2008 environment. However, many of them were also wealth owners for whom the other side of that, if you shift from the income effect of low interest rates to the asset effect, were also enjoying surges in their wealth. So the generation, when you say it helped younger people, especially as younger people didn't really have much asset wealth, I would say the effect of QE was actually to help, if anything, older people who were asset owners. On fiscal policy and borrowing, there is a real, I showed the models where we finance the increase spending on the welfare state out of taxes, which I think is fundamentally the honest way to do it. We did at resolution do the alternative estimate of hold the tax burden constant and assume we just borrow the money to meet these increasing requirements. And national debt goes through 200% of GDP before you've got to the end of this. So you do indeed have a lot of expensive borrowing, and at some point interest rates will eventually rise above where they are now, and at that point it would become very expensive indeed and would be financed by younger taxpayers on current policy.
Another question, please.
Just a quick question on, we've talked a bit about macroeconomic policy and the effect of QE, but it seems to me one of the other reasons perhaps why young people's wages are not growing so much is that since they have entered the labour force, productivity growth has almost stalled. Yep. Are they simply not being creative enough?
Yep. That's a bit of a twist at the end. That was a bit of a twist. They have, yes, that part of the story is indeed that we've had very poor productivity performance, and in the long run, that's incredibly important for determining pay. So why are all of us, but younger workers certainly, not delivering improvements in productivity? That is a very fair and important question, and I think I tried to hint at some answers to it. One reason is that moving to the high pay, high productivity areas is much less worthwhile than it was when the benefits of being more productive in those areas are captured by capital, not labor. That was the point of the early slide, that rather complicated slide. So if you do believe, and there's a very sort of fashionable economic theory around this, the agglomeration effects of being in an area like London, the South East, with millions of highly productive workers, the gains are increasingly captured by property owners. So that's, in turn, deters people from moving to live in this highly productive part of the economy. That's part of it. And secondly, and this is maybe a subject for another day, but going back to my time as universities minister, although we think the number of people going to university and into higher education is rising, it is rising, but it is rising more slowly than it was. So the times when productivity was improving were also times when the surges of highly qualified, of younger people into the jobs market who are significantly more qualified than people 5 or 10 years older than them. That trend has flattened out. So we've had a reduction in the rate of growth of educational qualifications and an increase in rents capturing gains from working in a high productivity area. And you kind of put those stories together and you start to see how this problem has arisen.
We'll take a question from the lady at the back, please.
Just trying to pass the mic to this gentleman here.
Thank you very much. I've also got 2 questions, if that's all right.
Let's start with one.
Well, the first one is kind of coming from a bit of ignorance, really, but you mentioned the Thatcher era having quite a big effect on where we are today. Would you mind explaining it for me personally?
Well, the argument was that if you think that there was a surge of young people born between 1945 and 65, think about what happens as they grow to adulthood and enter the jobs market, especially when before them, there are not many older people before them and not so many kids after them. So my argument is that these people were the oldest of them were entering the jobs market in the late 60s. And were coming to maturity in the jobs market under Mrs. T. The youngest of them were entering the jobs market in the mid-80s. So you had, these boomers were concentrated as workers, and not many of them were dependents on either side. So a society with lots of workers and relatively few dependents is one where tax revenues are quite buoyant and public spending pressures, because we tend to pay public spending for services for the young and the old, are reduced. So it's a kind of, in budgetary terms, it's the demographic sweet spot for a country to be in. And Mrs. T and Tony Blair enjoyed that demographic sweet spot. But now, as this big cohort grows older, instead, succeeding governments have a big generation of older people. Now, as one gentleman pointed out, and he was quite correct, they're carrying on working for a bit longer than they were, but nevertheless, who are at increased pressure on the welfare state. Of course, by the way, I should have said, on working older, they want to work to maintain their incomes. And again, if you were really going on this age factor, the trouble is once you start thinking of the demographics, it can affect everything. So, 1947. In 1947, that million people born in 1947 reached retirement age of 65 in 2012. That was the year when the government abolished the compulsory retirement age, when they faced 1 million people who would have lost that. So that is political pressure. You don't. It's not kind of explicit, but that was the reality. So the right of companies to say to anyone you are obliged to retire because you have reached the age of 65 was removed in 2012 when those people got to 65.
Thank you. My name is Sophie and I'm a millennial.
Ah, fantastic.
So I started your talk finding it quite funny, and then I felt filled with rage.
Yep.
And now I feel totally exhausted, primarily because I realise I'm paying for my father to travel to work when he earns 3 times I do. And quite frankly, I felt better about myself before I knew that information. But I wondered if you could give me some hope.
Ah, yes. Yes. Yes.
Hurrah.
Yes.
Hurrah.
Yes. Look, that's a very fair... And look, the book, the publishers have insisted on giving it this kind of apocalyptic flavour. But actually, I am fundamentally an optimist. And I think, looking back at what I've inflicted on you guys for the last hour, let me be... I'm optimistic from several points of view. First of all, this is not a completely insoluble problem. And actually, I do think older people care about younger people. They don't want the younger generation to have a tough time. And I think that what I am describing has happened not as a result of a deliberate conspiracy, but because time after time we took decisions without thinking what their implications were for the younger generation. So I don't think we have done it to deliberately do down the younger generation. And there is a legitimate and open political discussion that we had about how we fund our healthcare system and our social care in the future. But if you want an indication of how attitudes can change, what first got me into this issue was housing pressures. When I was a constituency MP, I'd do a surgery, and on a Friday afternoon, and the young guy working at Tesco's, and his partner working as a nurse would come to see me, and they were looking to find a house. There was nowhere they could afford. They couldn't even afford the private rents. They were living in his parents' spare room with the baby in a cot at the bottom of their bed. And they wanted to say, why can't I find a place to live? And then I'd go straight after that to a residents' association meeting of people in their 50s and 60s who were decent people, I knew the governors of the local school, who were running local businesses, running the local shops. And what they wanted me to do was to campaign against any housing development in the area. Now, in politics, you're not a kamikaze pilot. You don't enter. So my challenge was, how on earth do I try to do something to help those youngsters at my surgery without completely alienating the members of the Residents Association? And I developed over the years, I increasingly said to them, I know the estate you live on. The estate you live on, those houses were built in the 1960s and 70s. Previous generations built those houses for you so that you would have a place to live. And don't you think we have a similar obligation to build houses so that your kids have a place to live? And if you look at the polling attitudes on the crucial practical opinion question, which is, do you think more houses need to be built in your area? The percentage of adults agreeing to that has gone from about 25% a decade ago to about 50% now. So I think there has been a shift in attitudes to home building and development. So in other words, I think this is a winnable argument. We do actually care about our kids, and I think we also understand that we can't discharge our obligation to the younger generation simply and solely within the family for our kids. Of course, it's a completely admirable human instinct to want to help our kids, but we also want our kids, I say, of course we want to do that, but don't you want your children to live in a society that's economically efficient, that's socially mobile, where inheritance isn't the only thing that matters? Surely you want not just your kids to have a decent chance, you want other kids to have a reasonable chance as well, and people accept that. So I think it's a winnable argument. And then, finally, and the point of the Burke quote is this is not generational warfare, it's actually the links between the generations that keep a society going. And the appeal to our obligation to younger generations, I regard as a universal, inclusive appeal. So a society can have people of different religious beliefs, coming from different ethnic backgrounds, of different personal philosophies. I think one of the few propositions that unites us is surely we should expect the younger generation, if anything, to have a better life than us, and we don't want them to have a worse life than us. So I think this is both politically achievable, and it actually tackles it helps unite a society rather than divide it. And thank you so much for asking that question, because I wouldn't want people to think that this is all just kind of a hopeless problem. It isn't. It is not beyond this is not, in fact, the climate challenge that we were discussing yesterday is a much more fundamental one. It is possible for a society with reasonable demographics like ours properly to discharge its core obligations to older people, whilst also giving good prospects to younger people. It is not beyond the wit of man to do this.
David, that is the most fantastic way to finish this evening. It was a brilliant final question, may I say.
Yeah, it was. You're right.
But leaving us with great hope. I thought the quote from Burke about a contract for society, and actually that is what we are really aspiring to do, is to create a society which does care for one another. Thank you ever so much indeed for your time this evening, for informing us and entertaining us. And if we could thank Lord David in the most usual way, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's very kind of you.